Good evening. Welcome to the third broadcast by the Alliance for Unity, and I thank you very much for tuning in. Over 100,000 people viewed George Galloway's Alliance broadcast last week. We've also had dozens more applications from people who want to be candidates, and our team are now going through these applications. So thank you all who have applied in advance for your patience. Of course, we're still looking for more candidates. If you are interested, please contact us via either our website at Alliance for, that's for the number 4, allianceforunity.uk, or by email, contact us at allianceforunity.uk. at allianceforunity.uk. Now, I'm not George Galloway, of course. Everybody knows him. George has asked me to do the broadcast tonight. My name is Alan Sked, Professor Alan Sked. I'm Professor Emeritus of International History at the London School of Economics. And I'm here because I'm number 1 on the Alliance regional list for the Highlands and Islands list at the forthcoming Holyrood elections next May. And as you would expect, I've got a home in the Highlands. I have a home in Easter Ross. I live in the house that my mother was born in 1922. My mother passed away in 2017. And I looked after her for 4 years in the house as a full-time carer for 4 years. I gave up my chair at LSE. I surrendered my professorship because I wanted to look after her. She was in her mid-90s. She was very frail. She wasn't demented. She had a very good memory, a very good sense of humor. So looking after her full-time, 24/7 for 4 years was no way a burden. And I've done many things in life I'm proud of, but perhaps looking after my mother and making life comfortable and happy for her before she died was about the best thing I've probably ever done. Mum was born in Easter Ross. Myself, I was born in Glasgow. I was born in a council house in Glasgow, in Cathcart. And for 6 years, I lived in the great sprawling housing scheme at Castlemilk. And I went to the local school there. So I know what it's like for ordinary working class people in the west of Scotland living in these housing schemes. I know the challenges that they face. I went to the local primary school. From there, I won a scholarship to Allen Glen's School, which is a direct grant school. And from Allen Glen's, I went on to Glasgow University. And from Glasgow University, I went to Oxford, to the oldest Oxford college, Merton, where I did a DPhil under the supervision of a man who was then the world's most famous and probably best historian, A.J.P. Taylor. Like many Scots, I pursued a successful career in England. I taught at the LSE for, I can't actually believe it, 43 years, while still having a home in Scotland. You must never underestimate the number of Scots who work in England but keep their connection to Scotland. These people are ignored by the SNP. They're treated as foreigners, almost like traitors. But we hope to mobilize the huge number of Scots who live in England to take part in our crusade to keep Britain as part of the Union. Because I've kept my connection with Scotland, I should tell you about my rather long involvement in Scottish politics. As a youngster, as a teenager, I was obsessed by history, and therefore I was very interested in politics. And as a teenager, I was mesmerized by Joe Grimond, the Liberal Party leader at the time, who was extraordinarily charismatic and whom I thought should be Prime Minister. So I joined the Scottish Liberal Party, and then as a boy of about 17, I went down to the Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peebles by-election, where David Steele won the seat. After that, I got more involved. When I was at Glasgow University for my first degree, I became chairman of Glasgow University Liberal Club, Then I became the president of the Association of Scottish Liberal Students. I became the treasurer of the Scottish League of Young Liberals. And in 1970, when I moved on to Oxford, I came back up to be the Liberal candidate in Paisley. And my SNP opponent in that election was Margot MacDonald, whom I liked and admired, although both Margot and myself lost our deposits in Paisley. Scottish politics I find was great fun. I'm hoping it'll still be great fun. I'm hoping that the Holyrood elections will allow me to think back on lots of stories, because I've got lots of stories from my previous experiences in Roxburgh. As a teenager, I had to go canvassing. I had this electoral list, and one person I had to canvass on the list was a lady called Little Dorothy D. So I pressed her doorbell, and this huge lady, the size of a barn door, about 6 foot tall, came, and I said, "Are you Little Dorothy D?" And she looked at me and said, "Do I look like Little Dorothy D?" I said no and sloped off, but we won the by-election. And then in Paisley, as a Liberal, I thought, well, 1970, there were older people around who might remember Asquith and Lloyd George. And I found an old man. I said, "Do you remember Lloyd George when he was Prime Minister?" And the man said, "Yes, I remember Lloyd George. He was the bastard who put the Catholics on the education board when I was fighting in the trenches." So I made a mental note, don't mention Lloyd George. I met an old lady and I said, "Do you remember Mr. Asquith when he was Prime Minister? He fought this seat in 1923 in the by-election and won it." "Yes," she said. "Do you know Lady Violet Bonham Carter, his daughter?" I said, "No." She said, "I asked her. I said, 'Do you agree with Mr. Winston Churchill that you could bring up a child on 6p a week?' And the bit said yes." So I made a mental note, never mentioned Mr. Asquith. I used to enjoy politics in Scotland. Not everyone enjoys politics. One of my students at LSE was a former left-wing Labour MP called Arthur Latham, who lost his seat. And we were talking about politics. He said, "Nothing amusing ever happened to me. 20 years as an MP, nothing amusing." But of course, he was in the Labour Party, and I rather suspect that even today in the Labour Party, nothing amusing actually happens. Now, today, of course, I'm no longer associated with the Liberal Party. I'm now candidate number 1 in the Highlands for the Alliance for Unity. And the purpose of the Alliance for Unity is to get a pact between all the unionists in Scotland so that the major parties agree on only one candidate in the constituency list, one candidate opposed to each SNP candidate. The SNP can win seats in the constituency list because they've got 3 opponents in each seat. We want to stop that. We're putting pressure on the Tories, the Liberals, and the Labour Party in Scotland to decide on one candidate only to oppose the SNP in the constituencies. This seems to have common sense. If you want to get rid of the SNP, you'll have to come to an arrangement between yourselves and have one unionist candidate in opposition. We also want the unionists, the Tories, the Lib Dems and the Labour Party to give us a free run in the regional lists. We have people from all backgrounds in politics, and we want to dominate the regional list, so we believe that we can win the seats there. The major parties can have the constituency list, and after we defeat the SNP, we will hope that a government of national unity in Scotland can take us on a course of consolidating the union. Of course, it's a big adventure, but we're doing very well. Not only are hundreds of thousands of people tuning into our broadcasts, but we seem to have taken first blood already. 2 weeks, only 2 weeks after we announced our creation, the leader of the Scottish Tory party, Jackson Carlisle, resigned. We had said he was no good. We had said he couldn't lay a finger on the SNP, and he acquiesced. He said, "Yes, I'm not up to it, and so I'm going to resign." His probable successor, Douglas Ross MP, doesn't seem very confident either. He won't stand in the constituency list, although he wants to get into the Holyrood Parliament. We think he should stand in the constituency list, but he wants to be a regional member of the Scottish Parliament for the Highlands and Islands. He used to do that before he became an MP for Murray. He was an MSP for the Highlands and Islands, but quite correctly, he resigned when he took up a seat in Westminster. Now he wants to be both a Westminster MP and an MSP. I don't think the Scottish electorate are going to stand for that. You can do one job or do the other, but I don't think they're going to want you to do both. So he might be in trouble. We think a lot of the traditional politicians in Scotland are in trouble. Richard Leonard, for example, who's the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, well, according to the latest poll, 56% of Scots have never heard of him. If you've been a leader of the Labour Party in Scotland for years and 56% of the Scottish electorate don't know who you are, then maybe it's time for you to resign as well. But anyway, let me move on to that wonderful subject, the SNP. The SNP inhabits a little fairyland of its own. It lives in a kind of wonderland, completely divorced from reality. I was watching a program the other night. Andrew Marr was talking about Hugh MacDiarmid, the Scottish nationalist and the national poet of Scotland. MacDiarmid, of course, was a political extremist. He was kicked out of both the National Party of Scotland and he was kicked out even of the Communist Party, but he liked extremes. During the Second World War, MacDiarmid took the view that the Nazis posed less of a threat to the Scots than what he called the English bourgeoisie. He said he didn't care about the Nazis bombing London, and he also put forward the idea that when Hitler successfully invaded Britain, the Scot-Nats should run Scotland for Hitler in the same way that Marshal Pétain ran Vichy France for the Nazis after France fell. So that was his idea. By 1964, MacDiarmid had become a Scot-Nat candidate again. He was fighting the general election in the constituency of Kinross and West Perthshire. And he put forward the usual Scot-Nat tropes. Scotland had no influence in the United Kingdom. Scotland was exploited by the United Kingdom. Scotland could only prosper outside the United Kingdom as an independent state because she couldn't influence the British system to help her. Now, this was especially silly because his opponent in Kinross and West Perthshire was none other than Sir Alec Douglas-Home, who was not only a Scotsman, but he was also Prime Minister of the whole United Kingdom. So there you had this lunatic MacDiarmid saying that Scots had no political influence in Britain, while his opponent was a man who was actually Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. MacDiarmid got 127 votes, probably 127 too many. Alec Douglas-Home got 16,000. But the same lack of reality is shown by the SNP today. Sturgeon and her allies tell us that, again, the Scots today have no influence in Britain, that we're an oppressed minority, we're a colony, we're exploited. And yet, why is she there? Why do the Scot-Nats actually have power? Precisely because the UK government set up a devolution system which enabled them to take office. And the government that set up that devolution system from Westminster was a Labour one headed by Blair and Brown, who were Scots. And in fact, 80% of that government was Scots. So we have another sort of silly situation where the Scot-Nats are saying Scots have no influence, and yet the whole system was set up, and there's no influence in Britain, and yet the whole system was set up by Scots in Westminster under a Blair government which was really Scottish. It doesn't make sense. The Scot-Nats have a very weird view of Scotland. They've got a very weird view of Scottish history as well. They're teaching now in Scottish schools that Scottish history goes in a straight line from William Wallace to Nicola Sturgeon. Again, this is a madness, but it's part of the kind of Braveheart view of Scottish, a romantic view of Scottish history which Scot-Nats hold. And indeed, when I look back in the 2014 referendum, Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon were going around as if he was Bonnie Prince Charlie and she was Mary Queen of Scots. In a sense, this was appropriate because both were utter historic failures, just as Salmond and Sturgeon are. They've both failed to get either Scottish independence or to stop Brexit. They've been in the wrong side of the two great referendums to be held this century. Uh, Bonnie Prince Charlie, of course, was a failure. He lost at Culloden and then had to flee into exile in France. Mary Queen of Scots was a great failure. She fled into exile in England and later got beheaded. Well, I'm a very nice man. I don't want Nicola Sturgeon to get beheaded, but I do want her reign as Queen of Scots to come to an end. The other thing about Bonnie Prince Charlie and Mary Queen of Scots, of course, was they weren't really interested in Scotland. They were only interested in using Scotland in order to get the throne of England. And you know, Nicola Sturgeon isn't all that interested in Scotland either. She doesn't like running sort of mundane things like the Scottish Health Service or education system, both of which have deteriorated dreadfully under Scott Nat rule. She's obsessed by London as well. Everything she does is to try and upset the London government, the UK government, and to extort a second independence referendum. But there ain't going to be one, not in her lifetime, because she and Salmond made it quite clear that in 2014 the results of the Scottish referendum would be accepted as something which would last for a generation, not just a lifetime, but for a generation. So dream on, Nicola, you're not getting a second referendum. The two view of Scottish history should be not the Braveheart one, but the fact that for centuries Scotland was in baronial war and Dale was more or less a failed state. Scotland only began to flourish really after the Union of 1707. Then we got the Industrial Revolution, we got the Scottish Enlightenment, and we got Scotland helping to build up the empire, raising regiments that defended the Great Britain and Europe in a whole series of wars. Great Britain, in which Scotland became an integral part, ended up being the most successful state in the history of Europe, and certainly the most successful state probably in the history of the world. It's due to the British state, including Scotland, that we led coalitions, successful coalitions against Napoleon, against the Kaiser, against Hitler, and we preserved freedom in Britain, in Europe, and in large parts of the world. And as Britain, we built up a commonwealth, we built up a welfare state, and until COVID struck in January of this year, even after Brexit, Britain was growing economically at a faster rate than the European Union. So Britain is a great success story, but only after union. The Braveheart episode is something which has been distorted by the Scott Nats, and all these heroes like Mary Queen of Scots and Bonnie Prince Charlie should be put to one side as failures. I want to look at one or two parts of Scottish history and see how they can tell us about Scotland today. Look at the Highland clearances. This was done by Scottish landowners, they cleared out off the crofters in order to make way for sheep. And it was a terrible episode. But if you think that was bad, you must think of what would be the Scottish clearances if Nicola Sturgeon ever gets independence. Anybody with any brains or money or property in Scotland will simply pack up and go to England. That Scotland, which will be independence, will be an economic disaster area. It will have no currency of its own, it will have no central bank, it will have no reserves, it won't be able to finance the Scottish economy. The Scottish financial industry, the mainstay of the Scottish economy just now, will soon decamp and go to the City of London. And what's left with the Scottish economy? Harris Tweed, Scotch, tourism will not be able to finance the needs of the Scottish population. The saying that's got Nats that they will be saved by the European Union, but Scotland already has a national deficit of 8%. The EU demands that it shouldn't be higher than 3%. They've got a national debt of 100% of GDP. The European Union won't be interested in an independent Scotland. And, if they do get in, what will they have? 7 seats in a parliament of 700, no commissioner, and they'll be ruled by Berlin. Vergessen Sie Gallig, meine schottischen Freunde. Sie müssen Deutsch lernen. That's what the Germans will be saying to the Scotnats if they actually get into the European Union. But they won't get in. We should think of the Scottish clearances, hiding clearances, but also think of the Scottish clearances that will take place if we get independence. Then think of another aspect of Scottish history, the Darien expedition. Scots have often been deluded by schemes of economic survival, which actually don't work. At the end of the 18th century, they were persuaded by a man called Patterson that they should establish an empire, establish a colony in Panama, the Isthmus of Panama, in Central America, of all places. Hundreds of most of the Scottish money classes invested in this, in the Company of Scotland it was called, and it turned out to be an unmitigated financial disaster. And the only way the Scots recovered this Scotland at the time was very poor. Its trade was very bad, there's failing harvests, and now this huge expedition had failed and everybody with money had lost their money. How did they recoup it? Well, by the union with England. And one of the parts of the union, the Treaty of Union, was that those people who had lost money in the Darien scheme would be compensated. And believe me, after independence, if that were to be achieved, the financial and economic situation would be so dire that my feeling is that within 6 months, as after the Darien expedition, the Scots would be wanting to be bailed out by England and join the Union all over again. Another thing you might think of is that Scotland, when she emerged in medieval times as a united kingdom, was made up of different previous kingdoms and fiefdoms and territories, Scots, Brits, Picts, Highlanders, all coming together, making up what was centuries a rather fragile kingdom. You must remember, if Scotland gets independence, there's no reason to believe that Scotland will stay united. After all, the Orkneys and Shetlands will probably want to secede, and with them will go the fish, most of the fish and most of the oil. And if Orkney and Shetland secedes, probably the borders will secede, because they are rampantly unionist in the borders. So an independent Scotland may be shorn of both Orkney and Shetlands and the borders, and an independent Scotland has no army, no navy, no means to actually cajole these people into rejoining Scotland again. So independence might come along with partition. So think about that. You might not get a whole Scotland if you're independent. You might just get a part of Scotland claiming to be the whole of Scotland. The final aspect of Scottish history I'd like to bring up is the fact that although the SNP is now obsessed by Scotland's role in the empire and in slavery, the fact is that during the 17th and 18th century, Scots were enslaving themselves. Scottish law had it that if manufacturers lacked labor, they could just go out. If they found any able-bodied tramp or vagabond or someone who was unemployed, they could just grab them, take them to a bailey, register them as a slave, and they could even brand them with a branding iron, and these people became their slaves for life. Scottish coal mines in the 17th and 18th century were run by white slaves, Scottish slaves. Scottish salt pans were run by white slaves, i.e. Scottish slaves. And they weren't emancipated until 1798. And curiously enough, the great names of the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Ferguson, Fletcher of Saltoun, Viscount Stair, all of these people justified enslaving their fellow Scots. And it's very curious, but it's true, The Scottish moneyed classes and educated classes in 17th and 18th century thought that the cure for unemployment was slavery. Why did I bring that up? Because I think our freedom is now at risk under the SNP. The final point, the real point I want to make in this broadcast is that the SNP cannot be trusted any more with our freedom than it can be trusted with our economy. In many ways, the Scott Nats have got totalitarian tendencies. It's not just that they've already decided which songs can be sung or not sung at Scottish football matches, but think of some other things. For a start, the Scott Nats want to give every child in Scotland, a state guardian. Why would you want to give every child in Scotland a state guardian? This is something that happens only in North Korea. But the idea is that some social worker or teacher would report on your children, presumably back to the government, to the state. And so the state would know how you were treating every parent, how every parent were treating their children. And presumably if they didn't like what was happening, they could take your children away from you. That's one thing. Another thing we've learned from a video that's suddenly been discovered is that the Scott Nats apparently have a database on all the political opponents and people they regard as troublemakers. We have a video of the MP for Stirling, the SNP MP for Stirling, Alan Smith, telling a constituent that she had better watch out. She was in danger because she was already on the SNP database as a troublemaker. What is the SNP database? Why is it there? Is it legal? Who gave the authority for this SNP database to be brought into being? Nicola Sturgeon, someone else? What happens to you once you're on the SNP database as an opponent or a troublemaker? Is it a prelim to one day being taken off the street and being put into jail? Well, one doesn't know. So, Mr. Smith, please tell the people of Scotland, what is the database, who is on it, and what is its purpose? Is it legal, and who authorized it? And if that's not bad enough, Mr. Smith's boyfriend or husband or partner, a man called Jordan Henderson, apparently, who's a troublemaker inside the SNP and who's had to apologize for insults and misogynistic comments he's made to female members of the SNP, but he still wants to be a candidate to be an SNP MP himself. He tweeted before he deleted it, but it was photographed and passed through the Twitter system. He deleted, "Isn't it time for us to lock up people in Scotland who are English?" Lock up people who are English? Is this what happens to English people on the database? Mr. Smith, again, tell us what your partner meant. If you didn't say it, then I'm sorry, I apologize, but the evidence is this was photographed and spread around Twitter. Time to lock up people who were English. Xenophobic, racist, but certainly totalitarian. Why should you lock anybody up? It all goes back to this totalitarian threat that's potentially there. And if you think I'm joking, look at what Humza Yousaf, the Scottish Secretary for Justice, is doing. He's bringing in a hate crimes bill. And under his hate crimes bill, the charge of stirring up hatred is left undefined, but anyone who's convicted of stirring up hatred could go to jail. Now, there's no real defense against this. If you say you didn't mean to stir up hatred, it doesn't matter. If you say you didn't know you were stirring up hatred, it doesn't matter. If you say you just made a remark in the confines of your own home in private, it doesn't matter. You could be taken away, and it's up to the police and the courts, because the nature of stirring up hatred isn't defined in law. It's up to individual policemen and individual lawyers to decide whether you've been guilty of stirring up hatred or not. It's a crazy bill, but it's also a highly dangerous one. Now, supposing, and this is a great fear, supposing that one day in the future this bill is amended, or there's an amended act brought in that says that if you criticise the Scottish nationalists, or if you criticise the Scottish National Party, you're guilty of stirring up hatred, and you could be put into jail. This is the perfect means for creating a one-party state. Your opponents could be locked up on the grounds that they're stirring up hatred, and that would be law. So this is something, again, that's reminiscent of Nazi Germany. The Gestapo in Nazi Germany didn't have to go around sort of arresting people. They waited for neighbors to complain about other neighbors, and they would then take up these complaints and go and arrest those concerned. Under this Hatred Crimes Act, people of Scotland can, I don't know, go along to the police and say they heard a neighbour or anybody make some remark which could be construed, whether it was intended to be construed or not, interpreted as hatred. And they could tell the police that their neighbour or somebody they'd seen down the street in the pub had made remarks, and they should be arrested. And this is a great fear. People could get arrested for saying things that they didn't even mean to stir up hatred. The whole bill, of course, is being opposed by the Scottish lawyers, by the Scottish police, and by all the Scottish churches. It's a mad bill. It's bad in law because there's no definition of stirring up hatred, and it's mad in politics and with regard to civil rights, because anybody can be accused practically for any reason and arrested if the police so decide. And if it's extended to remarks made against the Scottish National Party, then of course we're on a road to a one-party state. Now, Hamza Yousaf is still defending the bill. He made a speech in the Scottish Parliament, but that had a really very strange conclusion, his speech, because at the end of it, he sort of lost it and began to complain that the bill was needed because of racial prejudice against non-whites. He began to spit out the fact that all the people who ran the judiciary were white, all the people who ran the legal service were white, all the people who ran the army were white, all the people who ran industry were white. And he spat out the words white, and it's quite clear he doesn't like whites. He may be an anti-white racist. Perhaps he should be arrested under his own legislation. But whatever, he seems to have it in for whites. There's nothing wrong with nearly all the positions of Scotland being of influence being occupied by whites. Mr. Yousaf ought to know that 96% of Scotland is white. Only 1% of Scots are black. Another 2 or 3% might be of Asian origin. But if they're like Hamza Yousaf, then I don't want them anywhere near power. He's one in power already, and he's probably one too many. But anyways, it shows you what the Scottish National Party is like. It's all run by a bureaucracy which is entrenched in Holyrood, run by Nicola Sturgeon's husband, Peter Morel, who's the chief executive of the SNP. The two of them are rather the Ceausescu's in Romania, or Kim Il-sung and his sister in North Korea. They have this totalitarian hold on the party bureaucracy, which, by the way, is funded by Westminster. Westminster gives the SNP £1 million a year in order to run this bureaucracy, supposedly to do research. And the bureaucracy is now in charge. And that bureaucracy, for example, is now supplying 1/4 of all Scotland MSPs in Holyrood. And it's also, we know from the testimony of SNP MPs, in a position to tell MPs in Scotland MPs in Westminster what they can say, what they can't say, what they can write and what they can't write. So we have this totalitarian bureaucracy which is in control of the membership of the Scottish National Party, but which also, as far as I can see, wants to control the population. Hence, we get this desire to have guardians for Scottish state guardians for Scottish children. We have a database of people who are opponents or people who make trouble for the SNP. We have one would-be Scottish National MP saying they should lock up the English. And we have Humza Yousaf's bill on hate crimes saying that, you know, people who stir up hatred against sexual, ethnic, disabled minorities could be arbitrarily arrested and put into prison. And there is this fear that the hate bill could be extended to people who make statements criticizing the Scottish National Party or criticizing Scottish nationalism, stirring up hatred against Scots, in which case you could be arrested and Scotland would soon become a one-party state. Anyways, enslavement of Scots in the 17th and 18th century might come back to haunt us. Think about Scottish history. Think about the wonder world of irreality that the Scotnats live in. Think of the really very real threat to Scottish freedom. Think of the threat to the Scottish economy. And if you put all these things together, you can't possibly vote for the Scottish National Party. What you should do is support the Alliance. You must get in touch. You must offer us your support, financial or any other way. If you want to be a candidate, get in touch. And I ask you, for the sake of Scottish freedom, for the sake of British unity, for the sake of the Union, and for the sake of the economic health of Scotland, support the Alliance, support what we're doing, and help us get rid of the SNP never-endum on Scottish independence, and do so at the next Holyrood election. Thanks for listening. Good night.